The war room fell silent as Colonel Rebecca Chen stepped through the reinforced steel doors. 27 pairs of eyes tracked her movement toward the head of the briefing table, where a holographic display showed the catastrophic situation unfolding across Eastern Europe. Behind those stares lay years of whispered doubts, dismissed recommendations, and bureaucratic roadblocks that had kept her from this moment. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I know what you're thinking. The woman they said cried during her first combat briefing is about to lead the most critical operation in NATO's history." General Harrison Matthews shifted uncomfortably in his seat. 3 months ago, he'd written in her evaluation that she, quote, allowed emotional responses to cloud tactical judgment. Now, with 16 million civilians trapped behind enemy lines and conventional forces in complete disarray, she was their only hope. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The same emotional intelligence they'd criticized was about to become Europe's salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Chen never intended to revolutionize military leadership. Growing up in Riverside, California, she dreamed of becoming a trauma surgeon, drawn to the precision required to save lives under impossible pressure. Her father, David Chen, a retired Air Force mechanic, and her mother, Patricia Williams Chen, a high school principal, had instilled in her a deep sense of service, but neither expected their daughter to challenge decades of military tradition. The transformation began during her sophomore year at West Point. Unlike her classmates who approached tactical problems with cold calculation, Rebecca consistently factored in human elements that others dismissed as irrelevant variables. During a simulated urban warfare exercise, while her peers focused on maximum efficiency and minimal casualties, she noticed something different in the behavioral patterns of the mock civilians. "Sir, the evacuation routes are causing panic," she'd told Major Franklin Reeves during the post-exercise debrief. "We're treating people like chess pieces, but fear doesn't follow tactical logic." Major Reeves, a veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, had initially dismissed her concerns. "Lieutenant Chen, warfare isn't a therapy session. Emotional considerations are luxuries we can't afford." But Rebecca persisted. She'd spent her free time studying crowd psychology, crisis management, and the intersection of human behavior with military operations. Her cadet thesis, Emotional Intelligence as a Force Multiplier in Modern Warfare, became required reading in several graduate-level courses, though many instructors remained skeptical of its practical applications. Her first real test came 18 months after graduation, during a humanitarian mission in Somalia. Lieutenant Chen was assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment's Support Division, coordinating refugee evacuations from Mogadishu. The operation seemed straightforward: establish secure perimeters, process civilians through checkpoints, and maintain order until transport arrived. Everything went wrong on the 3rd day. A miscommunication between Somali translators and American personnel led to a stampede at Checkpoint Charlie. Families became separated, children were trampled, and what should have been an orderly evacuation descended into chaos. Captain Bradley Morrison, the operation commander, ordered his troops to use non-lethal force to restore order. Rebecca watched in horror as panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. Mothers screamed for lost children, elderly civilians collapsed in the crush, and the Rangers' attempts to impose control only escalated the terror. In that moment, she made a decision that would define her career. "Captain Morrison, permission to implement alternative crowd management protocols," she radioed. "Negative, Lieutenant. Maintain current procedures." Rebecca looked at the scene before her. A young Somali mother was pressed against the checkpoint barrier, frantically calling for her daughter who'd been swept away in the crowd. An elderly man had fallen and was being trampled by people too panicked to notice. The Rangers, despite their best intentions, were making everything worse by treating the crowd as a threat to be contained, rather than terrified humans seeking safety. She made her choice. Disobeying direct orders, Rebecca removed her helmet and weapon, handed them to a stunned private, and walked into the crowd. Her actions violated every protocol she'd been taught, but she understood something her training had missed. Sometimes leadership meant vulnerability, not authority. Speaking in the limited Somali she'd learned during cultural briefings, Rebecca began moving through the crowd differently than the other soldiers. Instead of directing people where to go, she listened to what they needed. She helped the fallen elderly man to his feet, personally escorted him to safety, then returned for others. When she found the lost child, she didn't just reunite her with her mother. She stayed with the family, calming their fears in broken Somali, mixed with universal gestures of compassion. Something remarkable happened. The crowd began to settle. People started helping each other instead of pushing. The checkpoint that had been a bottleneck became an organized flow of humanity moving towards safety. Within 2 hours, they'd processed more refugees than they had in the previous 2 days combined. Captain Morrison was livid. "Lieutenant Chen, you directly violated orders and compromised operational security. Your actions put American personnel at risk." The reprimand in her file was swift and severe. Lieutenant Chen demonstrates emotional investment in mission parameters. Recommend reassignment to non-combat roles pending psychological evaluation. But Colonel Janet Williams, the base commander, saw something different in Rebecca's actions. She'd watched the checkpoint footage, analyzed the results, and recognized tactical brilliance disguised as insubordination. Colonel Williams became Rebecca's first mentor, teaching her how to channel her emotional intelligence into military effectiveness without sacrificing her humanity. "The military needs leaders who understand that our greatest strength isn't our weapons," Colonel Williams told her during one of their weekly mentoring sessions. "It's our ability to inspire trust in the people we serve alongside and protect. You have that gift, Rebecca. The challenge is convincing others that it's not a weakness." Over the next 8 years, Rebecca slowly built a reputation as an unconventional but effective officer. She revolutionized training protocols at Fort Bragg by incorporating psychological profiling into team selection. Her methods reduced PTSD incidents by 30% and increased mission success rates by 18%. Yet, every promotion came with resistance, every innovation faced skepticism, and every success was attributed to luck rather than skill. The breakthrough came during her assignment to the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division. Rebecca was tasked with analyzing why certain special operations units consistently outperformed others despite identical training and equipment. Her research revealed that the highest-performing teams shared one characteristic: they trusted their leaders not just tactically, but emotionally. "Emotional trust," she wrote in her classified report, "is the invisible force multiplier that separates good units from exceptional ones." Soldiers who believe their commander values their humanity alongside their tactical capabilities will attempt the impossible because they know their sacrifice has meaning beyond mission parameters. The report caught the attention of General Amanda Foster, NATO's deputy commander for special operations. General Foster had spent her career fighting the same battles Rebecca faced, proving that emotional intelligence wasn't incompatible with military excellence, but essential to it. When the crisis in Eastern Europe began escalating, General Foster specifically requested Rebecca for her staff. But even Foster couldn't have predicted how quickly that crisis would spiral into the most dangerous situation NATO had faced since World War II. The enemy wasn't a traditional military force. They were a sophisticated network of mercenaries, cyber warfare specialists, and local extremist groups united by a shared goal: destabilizing Western Europe through systematic terror. They didn't wear uniforms, didn't follow conventional tactics, and, most critically, they embedded themselves within civilian populations to make traditional military responses impossible. As conventional forces struggled to adapt to this new kind of warfare, one truth became undeniable. The emotional intelligence that military leadership had long dismissed as weakness was exactly what they needed to navigate an enemy that weaponized human psychology against them. Rebecca Chen's moment was coming, though she didn't know it yet. In 3 weeks, she would face a choice that would either validate every criticism ever leveled against her, or prove that the future of warfare belonged to leaders who understood that protecting humanity required, above all, remaining human. The first warning signs appeared on a Tuesday morning in Brussels. Dr. Elena Vasquez, NATO's intelligence analysis director, stared at 3 seemingly unrelated incidents that had occurred within 48 hours across Eastern Europe. A power grid failure in Warsaw that lasted exactly 97 minutes. A coordinated cyber attack on Hungarian banking systems that paralyzed transactions for 6 hours. the mysterious disappearance of a German engineering convoy near the Czech border. To most analysts, these were isolated events. To Elena, they formed a pattern that made her blood run cold. "We're looking at a coordinated destabilization campaign," she announced during the morning intelligence briefing. "Someone is testing our response capabilities and communication networks." General Harrison Matthews, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, dismissed her concerns with characteristic bluntness. "Dr. Vasquez, you're connecting dots that don't exist. Power grids fail, hackers target banks, and convoys sometimes take wrong turns. We can't militarize every technical malfunction in Europe." Elena persisted, pulling up satellite imagery on the main display. "Sir, the timing isn't coincidental. Each incident occurred during shift changes at our monitoring stations. Someone knows our operational patterns." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Colonel Rebecca Chen, seated in the back of the briefing room, studied the data with growing unease. Elena's analysis reminded her of something she'd observed during counterinsurgency operations in Iraq. Enemies who understood their opponent's psychology could predict and exploit behavioral patterns with devastating precision. "Dr. Vasquez," Rebecca interjected, earning sharp looks from senior officers who weren't accustomed to interruptions from relatively junior staff. "What's the psychological profile of these incidents? Are we seeing fear-based targeting or capability testing?" Elena's eyes lit up with recognition. Finally, someone who understood the deeper implications. "Both, Colonel. They're demonstrating they can penetrate our systems while simultaneously measuring our emotional responses. Notice how each incident targeted civilian infrastructure rather than military assets." General Matthews grew impatient. "Ladies, we're military officers, not therapists. If there's a genuine threat, show me enemy positions and troop movements." That genuine threat revealed itself 72 hours later. At 0347 hours Central European Time, simultaneous explosions rocked critical infrastructure across 6 countries. Not random terrorism, but surgically precise strikes designed to create maximum chaos with minimal military response options. Bridges collapsed during morning commutes, trapping thousands of civilians. Chemical plants released toxic clouds over residential areas. Communication towers went dark, cutting emergency services off from coordination networks. But the most devastating attack was psychological. The perpetrators had done something unprecedented. They'd weaponized refugees. Across Eastern Europe, massive convoys of displaced civilians began moving toward Western borders. These weren't ordinary refugees fleeing danger. They were terrified populations being systematically herded by an invisible enemy that used fear like a cattle prod. "They're not just attacking our infrastructure," Elena explained during the emergency session convened 6 hours after the coordinated strikes. "They're attacking our humanitarian values. Every refugee convoy that reaches our borders forces us to choose between security and compassion." The enemy's strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. NATO's military doctrine emphasized protecting civilian populations, but how do you distinguish between genuine refugees and potential infiltrators when the enemy deliberately blurs that line? Traditional rules of engagement became meaningless when your opponent used human shields not as protection, but as weapons. Rebecca watched the situation unfold with growing horror and recognition. She'd seen this strategy before on a smaller scale. Insurgents who understood their enemy's moral frameworks better than their enemy understood themselves. But this was something entirely different: strategic psychological warfare applied to an entire continent. "We need to understand who we're fighting," she said during a planning session with her immediate staff. "This isn't conventional terrorism or state-sponsored aggression. Someone has studied NATO's decision-making processes and designed their entire campaign around our predictable responses." Major Tyler Rodriguez, her deputy, looked skeptical. "Ma'am, aren't we overthinking this? Terrorists attack infrastructure, create chaos, exploit the confusion. It's textbook asymmetric warfare." "No, Tyler, look at the targeting selection." Rebecca brought up a tactical map showing the strike locations. Every attack site was chosen to maximize civilian displacement while minimizing actual strategic damage. They could have destroyed these facilities completely, but instead they damaged them just enough to create refugee flows. The brilliance of the enemy strategy became clear as the week progressed. European governments found themselves paralyzed by impossible choices. close the borders and abandon humanitarian principles, or keep them open and risk infiltration by hostile actors. Deploy military assets to provide security and appear to be imposing martial law on their own citizens, or maintain civilian authority and watch infrastructure crumble under coordinated attacks. NATO's traditional command structure struggled to adapt. Generals trained for conventional warfare found themselves dealing with problems that had no military solutions. How do you bomb an enemy that hides among the people you're sworn to protect? How do you maintain operational security when your opponent's primary weapon is the free press broadcasting every refugee's suffering? Rebecca observed the mounting frustration among NATO's senior leadership with growing concern. They were approaching this crisis like a traditional military problem, when it was actually something entirely different. A campaign designed to turn NATO's greatest strength, its moral authority, into its greatest vulnerability. The breakthrough came during a classified briefing about the enemy's composition. Intelligence agencies had finally identified the organization behind the attacks, a loose network calling itself the European Liberation Front, composed of mercenaries, cyber specialists, and radicalized locals united not by ideology but by sophisticated financial incentives. They're not fighting for territory or political control, Elena explained. They're being paid to create chaos. Someone is funding this operation specifically to test NATO's crisis response capabilities. Funded by whom? General Matthews demanded. That's where it gets complicated, sir. The financial trail leads through 17 different shell companies across 12 countries. But the operational patterns suggest coordination at a state level. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. They're not trying to win a war. They're conducting an experiment. Someone wants to know exactly how NATO responds to non-conventional threats. The implications were staggering. If the European Liberation Front was a testing ground for new warfare methodologies, then this crisis was just the opening act. Whatever conclusions the enemy drew from NATO's response would inform future operations on a global scale. As the situation deteriorated, Rebecca found herself in an unexpected position. Her background in psychological operations and unconventional warfare made her one of the few officers capable of understanding the enemy's strategy. But her reputation for emotional decision-making made senior leadership hesitant to rely on her analysis. The irony was painful. The same emotional intelligence that made her colleagues uncomfortable was exactly what NATO needed to counter an enemy that had weaponized human psychology. While traditional military leaders focused on force projection and tactical responses, Rebecca understood that this war would be won or lost in the realm of human behavior and mass psychology. The crisis reached a tipping point when the enemy launched their most audacious operation yet, the systematic siege of Prague, not through military occupation, but through coordinated infrastructure attacks that left 2 million civilians trapped in an urban environment rapidly becoming uninhabitable. As NATO struggled to develop a response that wouldn't escalate the situation into open warfare, one fact became undeniable. Conventional military thinking was failing. The enemy had successfully created a scenario where every traditional response played into their strategic objectives. Rebecca Chen stood at the center of NATO's war room, watching senior officers debate responses that she knew would only make the situation worse. The woman they'd criticized for being too emotional was about to become their only hope for understanding an enemy that had turned emotion itself into a weapon of war. The real battle was about to begin. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been stationed at NATO's forward operating base Delta, 40 kilometers outside Prague, for 18 days when the first civilian casualty reports began streaming in. As the base's liaison for refugee operations, she'd watched the situation deteriorate from manageable crisis to humanitarian catastrophe with growing desperation. The enemy's latest tactic was breathtakingly cruel in its effectiveness. They'd systematically targeted Prague's water treatment facilities, not to destroy them, but to contaminate them with non-lethal chemicals that cause severe gastrointestinal distress. 2 million people were now trapped in a city where drinking the water meant days of violent illness, but where bottled water had become more valuable than gold. They're not trying to kill civilians, Sarah reported during the morning briefing via encrypted video link to NATO headquarters. They're creating conditions that make life unbearable while keeping casualty numbers low enough to avoid triggering Article 5 responses. General Matthews, appearing increasingly haggard on the secure connection, struggled to comprehend the strategic implications. Captain Mitchell, what's the enemy's military objective? Are they seeking to occupy Prague or establish territorial control? No, sir, they're proving a point. Every hour this continues demonstrates that NATO can't protect European civilians from non-conventional threats. They're undermining our credibility without firing a shot at our forces. Rebecca Chen watched the briefing from her position at the strategy table, her mind racing through the psychological dimensions of the crisis. The European Liberation Front had achieved something unprecedented. They'd created a scenario where NATO's military superiority was completely irrelevant. Every conventional response would either escalate the situation beyond acceptable political limits or prove ineffective against an enemy that thrived on chaos. The breaking point came 48 hours later. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, a young intelligence officer fresh from his first overseas deployment, burst into the operations center with a decoded intercept that changed everything. His hands trembled as he handed the translation to Rebecca, his face pale with the implications of what he'd discovered. "Ma'am, we've intercepted communications between ELF cell leaders. They're not planning to stop with Prague. This is phase 1 of a coordinated campaign to systematically destabilize every major European city over the next 6 months." Rebecca scanned the intelligence report, her worst fears confirmed. The enemy had developed detailed psychological profiles for each target population. They knew exactly which infrastructure failures would create maximum panic in London versus Berlin versus Rome. They'd studied decades of crisis response data to predict how each government would react, then designed attacks specifically to exploit those predictable responses. "Show me the timeline," Rebecca ordered. Marcus pulled up a holographic display showing the planned operations. Phase 2 begins in 72 hours with simultaneous attacks on transportation networks in Amsterdam, Brussels, and Frankfurt. Phase 3 targets London's financial district using cyber warfare combined with coordinated infrastructure failures. "They've war-gamed our responses, ma'am. Every move we might make is already calculated into their strategy." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. NATO wasn't just failing to respond effectively to the current crisis. They were playing a game where the enemy had already seen all possible moves and planned counter-responses to each one. Rebecca studied intelligence with growing horror and recognition. This wasn't just sophisticated warfare. It was surgical deconstruction of Western civilization's fundamental assumptions about security and stability. The ELF had identified the psychological foundations that held European society together and was systematically attacking them. "They're not trying to conquer Europe," she said finally. "They're trying to prove that modern democratic societies are too psychologically fragile to survive coordinated stress. Every day we fail to stop them from validating their thesis." General Foster, appearing via secure link from NATO headquarters, addressed the assembled staff with barely controlled frustration. "Colonel Chen, what's your assessment of current response options?" Rebecca hesitated, knowing her answer would either end her career or force NATO to completely rethink its approach to modern warfare. "General, every traditional military response plays into their strategy. Deploying troops to Prague makes us look like an occupying force. Launching counterattacks against civilian areas violates our own rules of engagement. Negotiating with them legitimizes their methods for future operations. Then what do you recommend? We need to stop thinking like a military organization and start thinking like psychologists. The ELF has weaponized human behavior. We need to understand the psychological battlefield they've created before we can operate effectively within it." General Matthews' voice crackled through the speakers with barely contained irritation. "Colonel Chen, we're military officers, not social workers. Our job is to identify enemy positions and neutralize threats. Sir, respectfully, that approach is exactly why we're losing. The enemy positions are inside civilian populations. The threats are psychological states: fear, panic, despair, not physical targets we can bomb. Traditional military thinking is not just ineffective here, it's counterproductive." The debate that followed revealed the fundamental crisis facing NATO leadership. Half the officers present agreed with General Matthews that military problems required military solutions. The other half recognized that this war was being fought on psychological and social battlefields, where conventional tactics were worse than useless. The argument was interrupted by an emergency alert from Prague. The ELF had escalated their campaign with a new form of attack, that left even Rebecca stunned by its psychological sophistication. They'd begun broadcasting on hijacked television and radio frequencies throughout the city. Not propaganda or threats, but something far more insidious. Detailed instructions for survival during infrastructure collapse, delivered by professionals who appeared to be genuinely concerned about civilian welfare. The broadcasts offered practical advice about water purification, food preservation, and medical care that was actually accurate and helpful. They're positioning themselves as the protectors, Elena Vasquez observed via satellite link from the Intelligence Center. While NATO debates military responses, the ELF is providing practical assistance to desperate civilians. They're winning hearts and minds by actually solving the problems they created. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. The same organization that had poisoned Prague's water supply was now broadcasting instructions for making that water safe to drink. They'd created a crisis, then positioned themselves as the solution, all while making NATO appear incompetent and irrelevant. Rebecca watched the intercepted broadcasts with growing admiration for the enemy's tactical brilliance and growing horror at its implications. The ELF wasn't just attacking European infrastructure. They were systematically destroying the psychological foundations of trust in democratic institutions. They're teaching 2 million civilians that their own governments can't protect them, she explained to the strategy team. Every hour this continues, more people start believing that traditional authority structures are inadequate for modern threats. The crisis deepened when civilian riots broke out in 3 Prague districts. Not anti-government protests, but desperate conflicts over increasingly scarce resources. The ELF's psychological warfare had achieved its objective, turning European civilians against each other while positioning themselves as the only source of practical solutions. As NATO struggled to develop responses that wouldn't make the situation worse, Rebecca found herself in an impossible position. She understood the enemy's strategy better than anyone else in the command structure, but her colleagues remained skeptical of psychological approaches to military problems. The moment of truth arrived when intelligence confirmed that Phase 2 operations would begin in 36 hours. Amsterdam, Brussels, and Frankfurt would face coordinated attacks designed to replicate Prague's psychological collapse. If NATO couldn't develop an effective response before then, the crisis would expand beyond any possibility of containment. Rebecca stood before the assembled NATO leadership, knowing that her next words would either save or doom her career. The woman they'd criticized for being too emotional was about to propose the most emotionally intelligent military operation in modern history. The battle for Europe's psychological survival was about to begin, and everything depended on whether NATO could learn to fight a war where bullets were less important than understanding the human heart. The secure conference room beneath NATO headquarters had witnessed countless strategic debates, but never one quite like this. Rebecca Chen stood before a holographic map of Europe, watching red zones expand across major cities as real-time intelligence updated the scope of the ELF's planned Phase 2 operations. In 18 hours, 3 more cities would face coordinated psychological warfare designed to break civilian morale and governmental authority. The traditional approach has failed, Rebecca began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. Every military response we've considered either escalates the conflict beyond acceptable parameters or validates the enemy's narrative that democratic institutions are inadequate for modern threats. Admiral Jessica Kane, NATO's maritime commander, leaned forward skeptically. Colonel Chen, are you suggesting we abandon military solutions entirely? We have the most advanced fighting force in human history at our disposal. No, Admiral. I'm suggesting we use that force differently. The ELF has created a battlefield where conventional military superiority is irrelevant. They're fighting a war of perception, trust, and psychological resilience. We need to engage them on that battlefield. Rebecca activated a new display showing her proposed operation, codenamed Lighthouse. It represented the most unconventional military strategy NATO had ever considered. Instead of hunting enemy combatants, they would focus on rebuilding civilian trust through direct action. Instead of securing territory, they would secure minds. The core principle is simple, Rebecca explained. The ELF maintains power by positioning themselves as the only reliable source of help during a crisis. We remove that advantage by becoming more helpful, more reliable, and more present than they are. General Matthews shook his head in disbelief. Colonel, you're describing social work, not military operations. Our job is to neutralize threats, not compete in a popularity contest. Sir, respectfully, this isn't about popularity, it's about operational effectiveness. The ELF's center of gravity isn't their weapons or infrastructure. It's their psychological influence over civilian populations. That's what we need to attack. Rebecca walked them through the tactical details. Instead of deploying conventional forces to secure key infrastructure, Lighthouse would embed small teams of specialists directly within affected communities. These teams would combine military capabilities with psychological operations, engineering expertise, medical training, and cultural sensitivity. Each team includes a combat medic, a civil engineer, a communications specialist, and a psychological operations officer, she continued. Their mission isn't to hunt ELF operatives, it's to solve the problems that make civilians vulnerable to ELF influence. Major Rodriguez, Rebecca's deputy, had spent the previous 72 hours developing operational protocols for the unprecedented mission structure. Ma'am, how do we maintain operational security when our forces are distributed across dozens of civilian areas? We don't maintain traditional security, Tyler. We maintain something more important: trust. Each team operates with maximum transparency. Civilians know exactly who they are, what they're doing, and why they're there. The ELF's advantage comes from operating in shadows and confusion. We eliminate that advantage by operating in complete openness. The room erupted in concerned voices. Colonel William Harrison from Special Operations Command looked horrified. Colonel Chen, you're proposing to deploy our personnel without operational security protocols. That's not unconventional tactics. That's suicide. Rebecca had anticipated this reaction. Colonel Harrison, consider the ELF's tactical constraints. Their entire strategy depends on avoiding direct confrontation with NATO forces. They can't attack our teams without revealing themselves as hostile actors rather than protectors. Our transparency becomes our protection. Dr. Vasquez, participating via secure link from the Intelligence Center, provided crucial support for Rebecca's analysis. The psychological profile data supports Colonel Chen's assessment. ELF communications consistently emphasize their protective role toward civilians. Direct attacks on obviously humanitarian NATO teams would undermine their carefully constructed narrative. Admiral Kane remained skeptical. Even assuming the enemy won't directly engage our dispersed teams, how does this address the broader strategic threat? Amsterdam, Brussels, and Frankfurt will still face phase 2 attacks. That's where the operation gets interesting, Rebecca replied, activating another display showing communication networks across the target cities. We're not just positioning teams to respond to attacks, we're positioning them to prevent attacks from achieving their psychological objectives. The Lighthouse strategy was based on a simple but revolutionary insight. The ELF's attacks only succeeded when they created fear and desperation among civilian populations. If those populations had immediate access to competent, trustworthy assistance, the psychological impact of infrastructure attacks would be dramatically reduced. When the ELF attacks Amsterdam's transportation network tomorrow night, Rebecca explained, they expect to create panic, confusion, and desperation. Instead, they'll find that NATO teams are already embedded within affected communities, providing immediate assistance, clear information, and practical solutions. General Foster, who had remained silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke. Colonel Chen, this is the most audacious military operation I've encountered in 30 years of service. You're essentially proposing to beat terrorists at their own game by being better at helping people than they are. Yes, ma'am. The ELF's power comes from being indispensable during crises they create. We remove that power by making ourselves indispensable for solving those crises. The operational requirements were staggering. Lighthouse would require deploying 847 specially trained personnel across 23 cities within 16 hours. Each team would need to establish trust with local communities, coordinate with civilian authorities, and prepare for unknown forms of attack, all while maintaining the transparency that made the strategy viable. Major Sarah Kim from Logistics Command raised practical concerns. Colonel, the supply chain requirements alone are unprecedented. We're talking about pre-positioning resources for unknown contingencies across multiple countries. Sarah, that's exactly why this works, Rebecca responded. The ELF succeeds by creating scarcity and desperation. We counter that by creating abundance and preparedness. When civilians see NATO teams arriving with medical supplies, communication equipment, and engineering resources before attacks occur, it changes the entire psychological dynamic. The debate continued for 3 hours, with senior officers raising valid concerns about everything from diplomatic protocols to resource allocation. But gradually, a consensus emerged around a sobering reality. Conventional military approaches had proven completely ineffective against the ELF's psychological warfare tactics. Colonel Chen's unconventional strategy represented the only viable alternative to watching European civilization gradually collapse under coordinated stress. The decision came down to General Foster, who would either authorize the most experimental military operation in NATO history or stick with proven tactics that had already failed. She stared at the operational timeline, knowing that any delay would make successful deployment impossible. "Colonel Chen," she said finally, "your strategy violates virtually every principle of conventional military operations. It disperses our forces, eliminates operational security, and depends entirely on psychological rather than kinetic effects." Rebecca felt her career hanging in the balance. "Yes, ma'am." Which is exactly why it might work against an enemy that has designed their entire campaign around exploiting conventional military thinking. General Foster turned to the assembled staff. "Ladies and gentlemen, Operation Lighthouse is approved. We have 14 hours to deploy nearly 1,000 personnel across Europe in the most ambitious humanitarian military operation ever attempted." Quote, the room exploded into activity as officers began coordinating the logistics nightmare of Lighthouse deployment. Rebecca felt a mixture of elation and terror. She'd convinced NATO leadership to gamble everything on her understanding of human psychology and enemy behavior. In 14 hours, they would discover whether the woman they'd criticized for being too emotional had found the key to defeating an enemy that weaponized emotion itself. The psychological battle for Europe's future was about to begin, and everything depended on whether NATO could learn to fight with compassion as effectively as they'd learned to fight with force. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos had never imagined that her medical training would make her the tip of the spear in NATO's most experimental operation. At 0347 hours, she stood in the lobby of a Brussels apartment complex, surrounded by 43 civilians who had no idea their building was about to become ground zero for the ELF's Phase 2 psychological warfare campaign. "My name is Maria Santos, United States Army," she announced in fluent French to the assembled residents. "In approximately 6 hours, hostile forces will attack Brussels' transportation infrastructure. We're here to ensure that the attack fails to achieve its primary objective, making you afraid." The transparency of Operation Lighthouse still felt surreal to Maria, even after intensive briefing sessions. Her entire military career had emphasized operational security, yet here she was, revealing mission details to potential enemy sympathizers. But Colonel Chen's psychological analysis had been clear. The ELF's power came from uncertainty and confusion. Complete transparency would neutralize that advantage. Across Brussels, 17 other Lighthouse teams were conducting identical briefings in metro stations, shopping centers, and residential districts. Each team carried identical supplies: medical equipment, portable communication systems, water purification tablets, emergency food rations, and most importantly, detailed information about what was coming and how to respond. Meanwhile, in Amsterdam, Lieutenant Jessica Park was discovering just how radical the Lighthouse approach really was. Her team had been deployed to Central Station, where the morning commute was already underway. Instead of securing the facility against attack, they were preparing to help civilians cope with the psychological aftermath of that attack. "The key is speed and visibility," she explained to her communications specialist, Corporal David Wright. "The moment transportation systems go down, we need to be the first people offering practical solutions. Not security checkpoints or evacuation orders. Actual help." Corporal Wright had spent the previous hour establishing redundant communication networks using civilian infrastructure. "Ma'am, won't the ELF target our communications equipment?" "David, they can't attack our equipment without revealing themselves as hostile actors. Their entire strategy depends on maintaining the fiction that they're protecting civilians from NATO incompetence. The moment they attack obviously humanitarian operations, that narrative collapses." The psychological chess match was more complex than anyone had anticipated. The ELF had designed their attacks to create specific emotional responses: panic when infrastructure failed, desperation when government assistance proved inadequate, and gratitude when ELF broadcasters provided practical survival information. Lighthouse teams were positioned to disrupt each step of that psychological sequence. In Frankfurt, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres faced the most challenging assignment. His team was embedded within the financial district, where the ELF planned to demonstrate that modern economic systems were as vulnerable as power grids or water supplies. The psychological target wasn't just local civilians. It was global confidence in European financial stability. "Remember, we're not here to prevent the attack," Michael briefed his team as they established their coordination center in the lobby of Deutsche Bank's headquarters. "We're here to prevent the attack from creating lasting psychological damage." His civil engineer, specialist Laura Hamilton, had spent the night studying Frankfurt's financial infrastructure with representatives from major banks. "Sergeant, when the cyber attacks begin, the immediate response from bank security will be to lock down all systems. That's going to create panic among customers who can't access their accounts." "Which is exactly what the ELF wants," Michael replied. "Our job is to be ready with alternative solutions the moment those lockdowns begin. Portable ATMs, satellite communication systems, and most importantly, calm, competent people who can explain what's happening and when it will be fixed." The radical nature of Lighthouse became clear as the teams deployed. Traditional military operations focused on denying enemy objectives through force. Lighthouse focused on making enemy objectives irrelevant through superior civilian support. It was warfare as social work, conducted by soldiers trained to think like psychologists. At NATO headquarters, Rebecca monitored the deployment through real-time feeds from all 23 cities. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. 847 personnel operating without traditional security protocols, entirely dependent on civilian cooperation and enemy restraint. Every principle of military doctrine suggested it should be a disaster. Colonel Chen, General Foster said, reviewing the deployment status, "Your teams are reporting 100% successful integration with civilian populations. How did you achieve that level of acceptance so quickly?" "Simple honesty, ma'am. When people are scared and confused, they desperately want someone they can trust. Our teams aren't trying to impose authority. They're offering genuine help with no hidden agenda." The psychological impact reports were remarkable. In cities where Lighthouse teams had deployed, civilian stress indicators were significantly lower than intelligence projections had predicted. Social media sentiment analysis showed increasing confidence in NATO's capabilities rather than the declining trust the ELF strategy required. The first test came at 1,247 hours in Amsterdam. The ELF's cyber attack on the transportation network was precisely executed. Train systems shut down, traffic management computers crashed, and digital information displays went dark throughout the city. In previous operations, this moment would have triggered mass panic, as hundreds of thousands of commuters found themselves stranded without information or alternatives. Instead, Lieutenant Park's team immediately activated their response protocol. Within 90 seconds of the attack, NATO personnel were broadcasting clear information about what had happened, how long repairs would take, and what alternative transportation options were available. Portable charging stations appeared from mobile devices. Medical personnel assisted elderly passengers. Engineering teams began coordinating with city officials to restore systems. "The psychological effect is immediate," Park reported to headquarters. "Instead of feeling abandoned and vulnerable, civilians are seeing competent, helpful people taking charge of the situation. The ELF's narrative about governmental incompetence becomes impossible to maintain." The enemy's response revealed the brilliance of Rebecca's strategy. ELF operatives had planned to exploit the chaos following transportation failures by broadcasting helpful information that positioned them as protectors. But with NATO teams already providing superior assistance, the ELF found themselves irrelevant to the crisis they had created. More importantly, their own communications networks became visible as they scrambled to adapt to unexpected circumstances. For the first time since the crisis began, NATO intelligence teams began identifying and tracking ELF assets through their operational responses. The true test came when the ELF attempted to escalate their campaign. At 1,534 hours, intelligence intercepted communications indicating preparations for direct attacks on NATO teams in Brussels. The enemy had recognized that Lighthouse was neutralizing their psychological warfare capabilities and decided to abandon their protective narrative in favor of direct confrontation. "This is exactly what we expected," Rebecca explained to the emergency planning session. The ELF's entire strategy depended on positioning themselves as protectors while making NATO appear incompetent. Lighthouse has reversed that dynamic. They now have to choose between abandoning their protective image or accepting strategic failure. The Brussels incident unfolded with textbook precision. ELF operatives attempted to sabotage the portable communication equipment Sergeant Santos's team had deployed in residential districts. But their attacks were witnessed by dozens of civilians who had spent the morning receiving helpful assistance from NATO personnel. For the first time in the crisis, European civilians saw ELF operatives as aggressors rather than protectors. Social media exploded, with videos of masked figures attacking medical equipment and communication systems that had been helping neighborhood residents. The psychological narrative that had sustained the ELF campaign collapsed in real time. "They've been forced into the open," Elena Vasquez reported during the evening intelligence briefing. "Lighthouses have destroyed their ability to operate from the shadows. They're now identifiable as hostile actors rather than mysterious protectors." Rebecca watched the operational reports with a mixture of relief and amazement. The strategy that had seemed impossibly risky 12 hours earlier was proving devastatingly effective. By refusing to play the traditional military game, NATO had forced the enemy to abandon their primary advantage. But she knew the real test was still coming. Phase 3 of the ELF campaign targeted London's financial district with coordinated cyber and infrastructure attacks designed to trigger global economic panic. If Lighthouse could neutralize that threat, the psychological war for Europe would effectively be over. The woman they had criticized for being too emotional was about to discover whether her understanding of human nature could save not just European cities, but the global financial system itself. The London Stock Exchange had never hosted a military briefing, but desperate times called for unprecedented measures. At 0630 hours, Rebecca Chen stood before an emergency assembly of financial leaders, government officials, and NATO commanders in the exchange's main trading floor. The ELF's Phase 3 operation would begin in less than 8 hours, targeting the heart of global finance with their most sophisticated psychological warfare campaign yet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca began, gesturing toward the massive display screens that normally showed market data but now displayed ELF threat assessments, "we're facing an attack designed to trigger worldwide economic panic. The enemy isn't trying to steal money or destroy physical infrastructure, they're trying to destroy confidence itself." Sir Charles Pemberton, Governor of the Bank of England, looked skeptical of the military presence in his domain. "Colonel Chen, with respect, financial markets have weathered terrorist attacks before. Our security protocols and backup systems are designed to maintain operations under extraordinary circumstances." "Sir Charles, this isn't a conventional attack. The ELF has studied market psychology for months. They know exactly which systems to target, precisely when to target them, and most importantly, how to make the attacks appear far more damaging than they actually are." Rebecca activated a tactical display showing the enemy's projected attack sequence. Intelligence agencies had finally cracked the ELF's operational codes, revealing a plan of breathtaking psychological sophistication. The attack would begin with coordinated cyberstrikes on London's financial networks, but the real weapon was a carefully orchestrated disinformation campaign designed to amplify market panic beyond any rational response to actual damage. "Phase 3 isn't about destroying financial systems," Rebecca explained. "It's about convincing global markets that those systems have been destroyed. The ELF will create the appearance of catastrophic failure while leaving most infrastructure actually intact." Margaret Walsh, Chief Security Officer for the London Stock Exchange, studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm. "Colonel, you're describing psychological manipulation on a scale we've never encountered. How do we defend against enemies who attack perception rather than reality?" "The same way we've defended against them in Prague, Brussels, and Amsterdam," Rebecca replied. "We make ourselves more visible, more helpful, and more trustworthy than they are. But in London, we're not just protecting civilian morale, we're protecting global economic confidence." The Lighthouse deployment for London required unprecedented coordination between military and financial sectors. Instead of positioning teams in residential areas, NATO specialists would be embedded directly within financial institutions, central banks, and trading floors. Their mission: ensure that when the ELF attacks began, The financial community would have immediate access to accurate information and practical solutions. Commander Janet Torres, Rebecca's newly appointed deputy for financial operations, had spent the previous 72 hours learning more about derivatives trading and foreign exchange markets than most military officers absorbed in their entire careers. "Ma'am, the psychological vulnerabilities in financial markets are incredible. A rumor about system failures can cause more damage than actual system failures." Which is exactly what makes London the perfect target for the ELF strategy, Rebecca agreed. Financial markets operate on confidence and trust. If they can shake that confidence, they can trigger global economic chaos without actually damaging a single computer. The deployment began at 0800 hours with an announcement that stunned the financial world. NATO would be establishing a visible presence within major financial institutions, not to provide security, but to ensure transparent communication during potential cyber attacks. Trading floors that had operated in secrecy for centuries would host military communications specialists, whose job was to broadcast everything that happened in real time. "Complete transparency is our weapon," Rebecca explained to the assembled NATO teams during their final briefing. "The ELF's power comes from confusion and uncertainty. We eliminate that power by making everything visible and immediately understandable." The strategy faced immediate resistance from financial institutions accustomed to controlling information flow. Patricia Morrison, chief executive of Thames Valley Capital, voiced concerns shared by many in the sector. Colonel Chen, "Financial markets depend on controlled information release. Instant transparency could cause more panic than cyber attacks." Ms. Morrison, "That's exactly what the ELF is counting on. They've studied your information control protocols and designed their attacks to exploit them. When systems appear to fail, your instinct will be to limit information until you understand the scope of damage. That information vacuum is precisely where the ELF will insert their disinformation." The psychological battle lines were drawn. Traditional financial crisis management emphasized careful information control to prevent panic. The ELF strategy exploited that approach by making carefully controlled information appear unreliable or incomplete. Lighthouse would neutralize that advantage through radical transparency that made disinformation impossible to maintain. At 1,437 hours, the attack began. The ELF's cyber assault on London's financial networks was precisely calibrated to create maximum psychological impact with minimal actual damage. Trading systems slowed, but didn't crash. Communication networks experienced intermittent failures that appeared catastrophic, but were easily repairable. Most sophisticated was their attack on information displays. Numbers changed randomly for brief periods, creating the appearance of massive market volatility that didn't actually exist. "It's brilliant and terrifying," Commander Torres reported from her position on the London Stock Exchange floor. "They're not destroying systems. They're making systems appear unreliable. Traders are seeing data they can't trust, which is far more damaging than seeing no data at all." But the Lighthouse teams were ready. Within 90 seconds of the first system anomalies, NATO communications specialists were broadcasting clear, factual information about what was actually happening. Instead of allowing uncertainty to build, they immediately explained which systems were affected, how serious the damage was, and when repairs would be completed. "Market participants can see everything in real time," Patricia Morrison reported, her earlier skepticism replaced by amazement. Instead of wondering whether the data is reliable, they're watching NATO technicians verify each system as it comes back online. The transparency is actually increasing confidence rather than decreasing it. The ELF response revealed the desperation in their strategy. As their psychological manipulation failed to create panic, they escalated to direct disinformation campaigns. False reports began circulating on social media claiming that NATO teams were actually conducting surveillance operations on financial institutions. Anonymous sources alleged that the military presence was preparation for economic martial law. "They're abandoning subtlety," Elena Vasquez observed from NATO intelligence headquarters. "The disinformation campaign is becoming increasingly desperate and contradictory. They're claiming simultaneously that NATO is incompetent and that NATO is conducting a secret takeover of financial markets." The contradiction in ELF messaging proved fatal to their credibility. London's financial community could see NATO teams working transparently to maintain system integrity while reading increasingly hysterical claims about secret military agendas. The contrast between observable reality and ELF propaganda made their manipulation tactics obvious to anyone paying attention. The breakthrough came when the ELF attempted their most audacious psychological operation yet. At 1,634 hours, they hijacked financial news networks to broadcast fabricated reports of massive system failures and trading halts. The fake broadcasts were technically sophisticated and initially credible. But they made a critical error. They claimed systems had failed that NATO teams were visibly maintaining in real time. Financial professionals could watch live feeds of trading floors operating normally while hearing news reports that those same floors had shut down due to cyber attacks. The contradiction is immediate and obvious, Rebecca observed from the NATO Command Center. They've been forced into making verifiably false claims. Their credibility is evaporating in real time. The psychological turning point came when financial institutions began publicly thanking NATO teams for their transparency and assistance. Social media is filled with videos of military communications specialists explaining technical problems to traders, engineers repairing systems in full view of affected personnel, and medical teams assisting anyone affected by the stress of the situation. By 1,800 hours, London's financial markets had not only survived the most sophisticated psychological attack in history, they had emerged stronger. Trading volumes actually increased, as confidence in system reliability reached levels higher than before the crisis began. The ELF's Phase 3 operation had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of triggering global economic panic, it had demonstrated that transparent cooperation between military and civilian institutions could neutralize even the most sophisticated information warfare. Rebecca stood in the NATO Command Center, watching real-time reports from across Europe. Prague was rebuilding with NATO assistance. Brussels and Amsterdam had seen civilian confidence in government institutions reach historic highs. Frankfurt's financial sector was implementing lighthouse-inspired transparency protocols as permanent policy. And in London, the global financial system had just proven it could survive and thrive under direct psychological attack. The woman they had criticized for being too emotional had saved Europe by understanding that in an age of information warfare, emotion itself was the battlefield where wars were won and lost. 6 weeks after the collapse of the European Liberation Front's psychological warfare campaign, Rebecca Chen found herself in an unfamiliar position, testifying before a joint session of NATO's Defense Planning Committee and the European Parliament's Security and Defense Subcommittee. The same leaders who had questioned her emotional fitness for command now sought to understand how she had revolutionized modern military doctrine. Colonel Chen, began Dr. Heinrich Müller, chairman of the European Parliament's Defense Subcommittee, Operation Lighthouse achieved what conventional military responses could not. Can you explain how transparency became a weapon more effective than traditional force projection? Quote. Rebecca stood before the assembled representatives, acutely aware that her answer would influence military policy for decades to come. Mr. Chairman, the ELF succeeded initially because they understood something we had forgotten. In the information age, wars are won and lost in the realm of human psychology, not just physical battlefields. The aftermath of the crisis had provided unprecedented data on the effectiveness of psychological versus kinetic warfare. Dr. Sarah Johansson, NATO's chief analyst for strategic studies, presented findings that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern conflict. Traditional metrics suggest Operation Lighthouse should have failed catastrophically, Dr. Johansson explained. We dispersed forces, eliminated operational security, and made ourselves vulnerable to direct attack. Yet civilian confidence in NATO capabilities increased by 340% across affected regions, while support for extremist messaging dropped to historic lows. The success had come at a cost that few outside the military leadership fully understood. 17 NATO personnel had been wounded during ELF attempts to disrupt lighthouse operations. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been hospitalized after an improvised explosive device detonated near his team's position in Frankfurt. The transparency that made Lighthouse effective had also made NATO teams visible targets for desperate enemies. But the psychological impact of those sacrifices had proven strategically decisive. When European civilians witnessed ELF operatives attacking obviously humanitarian NATO teams, the enemy's carefully constructed narrative of protection collapsed permanently. Social media documentation of those attacks had done more to discredit extremist messaging than years of counter-propaganda efforts. The most significant lesson, Rebecca continued, is that emotional intelligence isn't separate from military effectiveness. In modern warfare, it is military effectiveness. The ELF lost because they treated human psychology as a tool to be manipulated, rather than understanding it as the fundamental battlefield itself. General Foster, now serving as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander following General Matthews' reassignment to strategic planning, provided institutional perspective on the paradigm shift. Colonel Chen's approach required us to reconceptualize the relationship between military power and civilian protection. Instead of protecting populations through force projection, Lighthouse protected them through trust building. The strategic implications extended far beyond Europe. Intelligence agencies worldwide were studying ELF tactics and Lighthouse countermeasures, recognizing that future conflicts would increasingly be fought in the realm of information, perception, and psychological resilience. The age of purely kinetic warfare was ending, replaced by hybrid conflicts where winning hearts and minds wasn't a secondary objective, but the primary battlefield. Rebecca's promotion to Brigadier General had been unanimously approved by NATO leadership, but more importantly, her methodologies were being incorporated into military academies across the alliance. The West Point curriculum now included mandatory courses on psychological operations, cultural sensitivity, and what had become known as empathetic leadership, the ability to understand and respond to human emotional needs as a tactical necessity. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, recently promoted after her performance during the Brussels deployment, had become a key advocate for integrating Lighthouse principles into standard military training. General Chen proved that understanding human nature isn't a luxury for peacetime. It's a requirement for victory in modern warfare. The enemy's perspective provided equally valuable insights. Captured ELF operatives, interviewed extensively by NATO intelligence teams, revealed the psychological planning behind their campaign. Viktor Kozlov, a former Russian intelligence officer who had served as the ELF strategic coordinator, proved surprisingly forthcoming about their methodology. "We studied NATO for 2 years," Kozlov explained during his debriefing. "Every operation, every training manual, every after-action report. We designed our campaign specifically to exploit predictable military responses. Your Colonel Chen did something we never anticipated. She made military responses unpredictable by making them genuinely human." The ELF's fundamental miscalculation had been assuming that military organizations were incapable of authentic emotional intelligence. Their entire strategy depended on NATO responding with conventional force projection that would validate their narrative of military oppression. Lighthouse had neutralized that advantage by demonstrating that military effectiveness and humanitarian compassion could be tactically integrated. Rebecca addressed the assembled leaders with a perspective shaped by months of unconventional warfare. The greatest threat to democratic societies isn't external military force. It's internal loss of trust in our institutions' ability to protect and serve citizen welfare. The ELF understood this. They attacked trust itself, knowing that physical destruction of infrastructure was less important than psychological destruction of confidence. The long-term consequences of the crisis were still unfolding across Europe. Cities that had experienced Lighthouse deployments reported unprecedented levels of civilian engagement with local government, increased volunteerism for community emergency preparedness, and, most surprisingly, growing interest among young people in military service focused on humanitarian applications. Prague had become a model for civilian-military cooperation, with NATO teams permanently stationed not as occupying forces but as community partners focused on infrastructure resilience and emergency preparedness. The program was so successful that other European cities were requesting similar partnerships. "What we discovered," Rebecca explained, "is that civilians don't just want to be protected. They want to be partners in their own protection. The ELF's weakness was treating populations as targets to be manipulated. Our strength became treating them as allies to be empowered." The testimony session concluded with questions about future applications of Lighthouse methodology. Representatives from Asian and African nations had already requested consultations on adapting psychological warfare defense strategies for their own regional security challenges. Dr. Mueller posed the final question that would define Rebecca's legacy. "General Chen, critics initially said you were too emotional for military command. How do you respond to that characterization now?" Rebecca considered her response carefully, thinking of the 847 NATO personnel who had risked everything on her unconventional strategy, the millions of European civilians who had trusted foreign soldiers in their communities, and the fundamental shift in military thinking that had emerged from the crisis. Mr. Chairman, I would argue that emotion was never my weakness. It was my qualification. In an age where wars are fought in the realm of human psychology, leaders who understand emotion, empathy, and trust have become our most valuable strategic assets. The military didn't need me to become less emotional. It needed to become more emotionally intelligent. 6 months later, Rebecca stood before the graduating class of NATO's newly established School for Psychological Operations and Humanitarian Leadership, watching 200 young officers who represented the future of military service. These officers had been trained not just in tactics and strategy, but in cultural sensitivity, psychological analysis, and what Rebecca had come to call operational empathy. You are the first generation of military leaders trained specifically for warfare, where understanding the human heart is as important as understanding battlefield geography, she told the graduating class. Your weapons will be competence, transparency, and genuine care for the people you serve. Your victories will be measured not just in territory secured, but in trust earned. The woman they had once criticized for being too emotional had fundamentally transformed how the world's most powerful military alliance understood the relationship between force and compassion. In proving that emotional intelligence was a strategic necessity, Rebecca Chen had ensured that future military leaders would be selected not despite their humanity, but because of it. The age of empathetic warfare had begun, and Europe had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon against those who would weaponize fear was the simple act of caring more about human welfare than military doctrine. In saving Europe, Rebecca had saved something far more important: the idea that strength and compassion were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of true leadership in an interconnected world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.